All right, everybody. We have now done analysis with secondary dominants. We've harmonized baselines with secondary dominants, so we know how to pick chords. Now it's time to do some part writing with secondary dominants. So let's get in there and figure out sort of what the questions we need to be asking about this application of these new chords is. So we're going to talk about writing with secondary dominants, really specifically doing part writing with secondary dominants. Now, as we've seen, if we think about sort of the way that we use secondary dominants in function, oftentimes they're participating in chord progressions that we already, have part writing for, like deceptive motion or moving to a half cadence or something. And so a lot of the time, the secondary dominants just sort of are a nice way to strengthen that motion, and the part writing is going to reflect that. And the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind that's going to come up, whether it's in one of these familiar progression scenarios or whether it's the type of instance where a secondary dominant is really just kind of showing up out of the blue, the thing that we really need to keep in mind is that there are going to be extra leading tone resolutions, many, many, many more compared to using the diatonic, just the chords in the key, right? When we just use the harmony in the key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those chords, there's only one leading tone, right? There's the leading tone of the key. So if I'm in, if I'm in E, the only leading tone I need to keep track of is D sharp, right? And we know that D sharp could be easily found as part of a 5-7 chord or as part of a 7-7 chord, right? Or I'll do like a 7-6-5 kind of thing. We could get, or make it a fully diminished, right? That one leading tone is all we need to worry about. Well, that's gonna show up a lot more because any dominant chord, whether it's the diatonic dominant chord in the key or a secondary dominant chord, has a leading tone. The new added leading tones that point us places other than tonic are the big sort of heart of the secondary dominant technique. So that's what really makes them work. And so we need to sort of keep that in the forefront of our mind. So the good news here is that we're not going to treat leading tones any differently, right? Any leading tone that we get, whether it's of the key or whether it's a secondary dominant pointing us somewhere else, any leading tone we encounter, we're going to sort of resolve it upwards. Now, that means that we're going to run into situations that are different than what we would expect or what we might see if we were just purely using diatonic chords, but that's okay. We just got to keep in mind that the resolution of the leading tone is by far the priority. Now, we also know that we've been adding in a lot more seventh chords to the mix here, because why not? And so we have to keep that in mind along with leading tones. It's no surprise that these tendency tones that we started talking about are really, really, really central to the technique here. So leading tone resolves upwards, seventh resolves downwards, and that's the name of the game. And that is the priority for what we're doing, right? I think that's an important thing to point out. We are prioritizing the resolution of the tendency tones because it makes each individual line make the most sense, because that's where these notes, sort of generally speaking, want to go. That's why we call them tendency tones. So even if it causes some odd doublings, incomplete chords in places that we don't expect, we're saying that that's okay, and that we are more interested in resolving the tendency tones, leading tone up, seventh down, than we are at sort of making sure every chord has all the notes, every chord has the fifth, or making sure that only the root is doubled. That's not the priority, right? And the beauty here is we can get away with some of these strange doubling, complete, incomplete chord situations. We can get away with all of that if the function of the harmony is in a sort of logical manner, and if the part writing allows these notes that have really specific directional goals, if it allows them to do really what they want to do. All right, so let's look at some examples here. So these are things that are pretty straightforward. What we're going to see here is that there are many situations where adding a secondary dominant into a progression in place of a chord we would normally find really almost has, it's just a one-for-one, no problem type of substitution. So let's look here. If we're in the key of G major, right, we could have a nice 4 to 2 to 5 progression, and then we'd expect that 5 to go to 1. So 4, and this is standard part writing, taking common tones where we can, right? Life is good. But, if we, instead of using the 2 chord, let's say we wanted to use the 5 of 5 chord, right? Because that's a different type of A chord that we could get. So here in G, this 2 chord is A minor, A, C natural, E. But we could make use of the fact that A to D is a fifths relationship, right? Circle of fifths. A is 5 of D, bum bum. And so if we make this an A major chord, not an A minor chord, if we make it major by raising C natural to C sharp. C sharp is the leading tone of D, right? So that's sort of that extra leading tone that we've got. And what we're going to find is, look, all the part writing stays the same. And the end result, this is beautiful, is that really the soprano line gets a lot more interesting. So instead of just going dun, dun, da, right now they're going to go C, C sharp, D. And that leading tone, C sharp to D, resolves, right? So we're really finding that there are these nice situations where adding in the extra leading tone doesn't really change anything. And we'll see that with the sevenths. So here's a 6 to a 2-7 chord to a 5, right? So we're in G still. I know it can feel like we're sort of going elsewhere, but right, 2-7, and we know in that 2-7 chord we would want the 7th in the alto voice to resolve downwards. Well, let's look what's going to happen. Right? Nothing much here. And we've got the same situation where in this scenario, we are leaving out the 5th of this chord. So we've got root, 3rd in the soprano. No one's singing the 5th. And the alto has the 7th. And we know that whenever we have a dominant 7th chord, even when it's a secondary dominant 7th chord, if the 5-7 of whatever is incomplete, the triad it resolves to will be complete, right? So since we were on an incomplete 5-7 of 5, this 5 chord is going to have all of its members. So we've got root in the bass, doubled in the soprano, 3rd in the alto, 5th in the tenor voice, and of course, leading tone resolving up, 7th in the alto, resolving down, right? So these are situations where really just adding in a secondary dominant seems like piece of cake, no issues here. And it's nice that some of those exist, because there are some spots where we need to sort of have a bit more of a wider view into some of the ramifications of adding in these chords, which have much more needy voice leading, right? Our tendency tones are very needy notes. So let's look at an example here where the end result is going to be very different from what we would start with if we only used chords in the key. So we're in F here, right? And we're doing a 2-5-1, or sorry, 2-5-6. We're doing deceptive motion. So here's 2-7 to 5 to 6. And now we know 2-7 chord, We've got the 7th, which is going to resolve downwards in the alto. And then in deceptive motion, we know we like to double the 3rd of the 6th chord. So the altos and the sopranos hanging out together on F. That's lovely, smooth voice leading. All of the voices, basses, here come the tenors, ba-da-da, altos, sopranos, everybody has really nice lines there. Now, what happens, though, if we add in some chromatic notes? What if we say, yeah, 2/7 is great, but I want to have a 5/7 of 5. I want to take this G minor chord, G, B flat, D, F, right? G minor 7. And I want to make it G, B natural, D, F, which is 5 of C, right? So this is a 5/7 of 5 because G is 5 of C, bum-ba-da-ba, and B natural. Very importantly here, B natural is the leading tone of C. Now, what's the problem by just making the shift? On the last slide, we saw that sometimes you can just change it out. G minor is a great chord, but let's do G dominant 7 and really push it towards C. Well, the problem is that the sopranos have the leading tone here. And so if our sopranos are hanging out on B natural, we can hear that that wants to go to not G. You see what I mean? So by adding these leading tones, we kind of have to keep in mind that it wants to resolve, right? And we don't have the same freedom necessarily. And so we really would end up with this what I wrote here, FLT, frustrated leading tone, not resolving, which is pretty sad sounding, womp womp, right? So we really want that leading tone to resolve, and that's a crucial thing to keep in mind when we're writing these secondary dominants, that we still have to keep these tendency tones in mind. But now we can see that if we do resolve that, we're doing our complete 5/7 chord to incomplete 1 chord where we've got 1, 2, 3 C's, and then it's sort of kind of awkward getting to the 6th chord. So all this to say, we need to really be mindful of the much larger percentage of chords now that are going to have tendency tones in them, and realize that this can lead to some very strange situations where all of a sudden in the middle of your writing, you may have a 5 chord that only has 3, or that has 3 roots and 1/3 and no 5th. We haven't really dealt with that too much, and so I just wanted to sort of point out that having this new, more directed type of harmony can impact what we need to be thinking about in terms of the voice leading, because we can't necessarily always follow these nice cut and dry, it'll work kind of as predicted situations. So not to scare you away from the secondary dominants, but just to really throw out there that it can be a little strange to end up with these triple root chords because we resolved our tendency tones. And again, just to reiterate, we are prioritizing that. Even though we end up in weird situations, we want to make sure we resolve our leading tones. We resolve the 7th of these chords. The individual line making sense will make the harmony make sense. That sort of may seem like a backwards way of saying it. It sort of probably seems like, well, if the chords make sense, then each melody that each singer or each instrumentalist is playing or singing makes sense. It really doesn't work that way. We want to make sure that the individual lines are logical, and that will help the harmony to feel as directed and purposeful as it can. And so that sort of is, we need to recalibrate a little bit. We would call that horizontal thinking or long line thinking. Okay, last thing I want to point out here is just 2 noteworthy scenarios. We've talked about both of these, but I really want to just point them out that we've got some extra stuff we have to consider with these secondary dominants in the voice leading. So we're going to be in B flat for these examples. And the first is motion with the cadential 6/4. So here we are in a 5/6/5 of 5. Remember that in B flat, F is 5. And so we've got this beautiful E natural leading tone to 5, right? E is the leading tone of F. Right? In the key, we would have E flat, but instead we've got E natural leading to F. So that's a 5 of 5 chord. Remember, it's a member here of a C chord, C, E, G, B flat. So C is 5 of F. Right, so that's where we're getting this chord from. And what we're finding is we've got these 2 tendency tones because this is a 5/6/5 of 5 chord. We can see in the bass the leading tone resolves. But which voice has the 7th of this chord? Root in the tenor, 3rd in the bass, 5th in the alto, 7th in the soprano. The sopranos need to resolve that. See how the sopranos don't resolve that 7th right away. So the resolution of the 7th is delayed in this situation because it moves through the cadential 6/4. So the B flat is the 7th, and look, it is eventually going to resolve downwards from B flat to A. Right, this resolution should go from this 5 of 5 chord to the 5 chord that we eventually get. Right, and we can see we get to that root position 5 chord, 5/3. But with the cadential 6/4, we don't get there immediately. So it does resolve, but not right away. There it is. Because the cadential 6/4 is all about becoming the root position 5 chord. So don't let this deter you from really good cadential 6/4 writing. Okay, so that's one situation. And we saw a similar thing with the 7th when we talked about 2/7 or 2/6/5 moving to the cadential 6/4. So this idea of the 7th eventually resolving. It's been around, but it's worth mentioning. This other one, this is a fairly new thing. Now, we did talk about this in class the other day, but I want to point it out here. It has to do with the 5 of 4 chord in major. So we're here in B flat. So after our cadential 6/4 resolution, we've got a 1 chord. And here we are, we're moving to a 5/7 of 4, which then goes to 4, and we can imagine that just goes off into wonderful directions. Now, the thing that we are probably noticing here, and we have been noticing, is that there is a note, a chromatic note altered in this 5/7 of 4 chord, but it's not a note being raised. It's not the leading tone being raised. Instead, we've got the 7th of this chord being lowered. A natural, which we get in B flat, has become a flat. And so this is something that's a little bit unique. And remember, we talked about this, that the leading tone of 4 is E flat in this case. The leading tone of E flat is D natural, which is already in the key. So if we look at this 5/7 of 4 chord, there's a D natural there from the key signature. We don't need to adjust that to get the leading tone of E flat. So to make this a chromatic chord, to make this a secondary dominant chord, we need to make sure that we have the lowered 7th. We need this to be a dominant 7th chord, major triad with a minor 7th on top, to ensure that this is a chromatic harmony. Because if we just say, you know what, these 5, 6, 5 of 5, these 5, 7, and 4 chords are great, but I'm just kind of a triad type of person. I'm just going to do 5 of 5. That's great, because the 5 of 5, going back to this part of this example, would still have the leading tone, E natural moving to F. It just wouldn't have the 7th, 5, 6 of 5. Still has a chromatic leading tone. E natural, F. I made that more chromatic than it needed to be. If we tried to do the same here with the 5 of 4 and said, I don't want to do a 7th. I don't want to have a 5, 7 of 4 chord. I just want to have 5 of 4. Well, this chord and the 1 chord would be spelled the exact same way. We'd be moving, here's through the cadential 6-4. Here comes 1. And this would be our 5 of 4 chord. It still sounds fine moving to 4. 1, 4. But it doesn't sound like it needs to go to 4. It doesn't have that chromatic leading motion to 4. Even though the leading tone, D to E flat, is present. Right? It's the chromatic element that reframes these harmonic ideas. So 1 to the 5, 7 of 4. See how that's pushing me to E flat? And it's because we need a chromatic note in there. So while you're using the 5 of 4, it must be a 7th chord. Now, my perspective is that all secondary dominants should be 7th chords because A, 7th chords are awesome. They make everything sound deeper and richer. And C, or third point, whatever, I don't have to remember then that there's a unique circumstance about 5 of 4, right? If I just always make my secondary dominants 7th chords, this will happen naturally. But it's worth pointing out anyway, in case you don't want to overindulge on 7th chords. So you really need to make sure that this chord needs to be a 5. To be a 5, 7 of 4, it needs the chromatic lowered 7th. This would not be a secondary dominant if it was an A natural here. So just making it a 7th chord doesn't make this chord have to go to 4. Sounds lovely going to 4, but it doesn't lead us there in the same way because A natural isn't a note that has any relationship to the key of E flat, right? But in the key of E flat, much differently than the key of B flat, we would have an A flat. It would be B flat, E flat, A flat, and so that A flat added to this chord, B flat, D, F, A flat, that makes that sound a lot more like the type of 5 chord we get in E flat than a chord that we get in B flat, the key we are in. So those are just some, little noteworthy things to look at here. I'm hopeful that all over you are getting the idea that we don't want to see that. Hoping that all over you're getting the idea that you really do just want to make sure that you're taking care of your leading tones, your 7ths, and prioritize resolving those, even if it ends up in some slightly strange places. It'll make the music have the most internal logic regardless.